After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered together there were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. The disciple whom loved Jesus said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging their net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal file there, with fish on it, and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow me."
How do you typically end your day? Do you have an evening ritual or spiritual practice that invites you to review the day that you just lived through and to reflect on what it might mean? The triumphs and the defeats, the breakthroughs and the setbacks, the opportunities seized or squandered, the epiphanies and encounters and wonders and trivialities that came and went. Each day holds wisdom and insight to be gleaned about who we are and how we are and why we are and where God is and the messiness of our lives. But rarely does this wisdom reveal itself freely on its own. It demands our attention and intention. The day's wisdom, like the day itself, is often elusive and fleeting. In the words of the late poet Charles Bukowski, "The days run away like wild horses over the fields." Or as the great prophet Ferris Bueller famously said, "Life moves pretty fast, and if you don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it." What wisdom does the day long to teach us? And how can we stop and look around before we miss it? The Apostle Paul once gave the early Christians some timeless advice. He said, don't drift along. Give yourself regular checkups. He said, you need firsthand evidence that Christ is in you. About 400 years ago, the Jesuits came up with a ritual for these daily checkups. It's a form of prayer called the Examen, which provides a formula for intentional self-examination at the end of our day. The Examen is a form of prayer, but there are no specific words required of us, only some simple guidelines to follow as we review our actions and thoughts and emotions in the presence of God. The Examen is something like what NFL teams do after every football game. The day after every game, whether a win or loss, players and coaches huddle together to review the game film, to assess their on-field performance. They'll spend hours watching film of each play to learn from what exactly happened. Maybe a player was out of position or didn't execute the play as it was designed, or maybe his technique was poor, or he misread a formation or missed a block. The question is, what worked and what didn't? And what can we learn in preparation for the next game? It's called reviewing the tapes, and every team does it. Over the next several weeks, I will lift up 7 questions in the spirit of the Examen to help you review the tapes of your day to find how God is present and working in your life. Because while God is actively working in every moment of our lives, we sometimes have to take a magnifying glass to the seemingly ordinary in order to see God and to feel gratitude for the gifts of each day and of course to make up for any mistakes that we may have made. If you've ever struggled with prayer or wondered how to pray or what words to use, the Examen is one of the most accessible forms of prayer. It requires just a few steps. First, to ground yourself in God's presence, giving thanks for God's love for you. Second, to ask for grace to understand how God is acting in your life. Third, to review your day, recalling specific moments and your emotions at that time. 4, to reflect on what you did, what you said, what you thought or felt in those moments. And 5th, looking toward tomorrow, to reflect on how you might collaborate with God's work in your life. And finally, you conclude with the Lord's Prayer. For many of us, reflecting on the totality of our day can be overwhelming, as so much transpires in just one day of our lives. Now, where do we even begin? It helps to have a single question to focus and guide us as we review our tapes. And so of the 7 questions I want to offer you in this series, the first is this: have the ears of my heart opened to the voice of God today? God is always speaking to us, sometimes in shouts, often in whispers, sometimes through the voices of others, but often in the quiet recesses of our consciousness. At the end of the day, we ask ourselves, have the ears of my heart opened to the voice of God today? It's a question that leaps off the pages of today's story from John's Gospel, a story about the disciples of Jesus who have just endured the devastating loss of their friend and rabbi, a rabbi who had been crucified by the empire as a common criminal, and whose lifeless body, after having been laid in a tomb, has now come up missing. In the story, there have been sketchy rumors of Jesus' resurrection, but there's no hard and fast evidence for it, just a tombstone rolled away, a heap of linen wrappings left in the tomb, and the testimony of a woman, Mary Magdalene, who claims that she saw Jesus strolling through the graveyard on his own 2 feet and actually spoke with him. But in the story, nobody's really buying her story. And now it's about a week later in the story, and he claims that Jesus is alive or overshadowed by the painful truth that he's just not here. When you lose someone you love, the world just looks different. Your routines are upended. Your thoughts are scattered. Your heart just aches. Reality sets in. The disciples had left everything behind to follow Jesus, and now, after 3 years, he's gone. What are they now going to do with their lives? Jesus had done everything for them while he was with them. Like sheep, all they had to do was listen to the voice of their shepherd and follow his lead. But now there is no voice to heed and no shepherd to follow. This is how it works with grief and loss. You try to heal the best you can, but there's just never enough time. The world just keeps on spinning, and you have to get on with your life. The world, with all its demands, has just no mercy. It waits impatiently for you. There's work to be done and mouths to feed and obligations to meet and family and friends and a future all whispering, get on with your life. Which is why after so many days without Jesus, Peter can't sit around and wait any longer. He announces to the other disciples one evening, I'm going fishing, he says. And several of them go with him because they don't know what else to do but to return to what they know best, fishing. Back to their boats, back to their nets, back to the familiar shorelines of the Sea of Tiberias. And it's there, not in a temple, not in some holy place set apart from the world, but in the ordinary, familiar places of their world, that Jesus appears to them. And this matters. It reminds us that we encounter God not by escaping from our world, but by inhabiting our world in all of its ordinariness. That God speaks most often in the familiar landscapes and routines of our lives. It's like the Buddhist koan about the monk who enters the monastery in search of enlightenment. And he asks the master, where can I find enlightenment? And the master says, have you eaten your meal? And the monk replies, yes, I have. And the master says, then go wash your bowl. Our question at the end of the day, have the ears of my heart opened to the voice of God today? That question should always, always lead us back to the mundane, ordinary, familiar moments of our lives. The simple, unspectacular encounters when all we are doing is washing our bowl. Why? Because the writer Paula D'Arcy once said, God comes to us disguised as our life. God's presence and voice seem always to prefer the humdrum and unremarkable aspects of our existence over the extraordinary or so-called religious experiences of our lives. And for the disciples, that divine presence and voice comes after they've been fishing through the long night and have caught nothing. They're tired and hungry and defeated. Their empty nets reflect not just the absence of fish, they mirror the disciples' own inner lives. Exhausted, threadbare, empty, and unsure about how to move forward with their lives. And that's when they hear the voice of God. Children, asks the risen Christ, have you no fish? He calls them children because they're helpless and vulnerable, and they're powerless to fix their situation. And that's a reminder that it's almost always true that only when we find our nets empty and we acknowledge that our lives are beyond our ability to control or fix or manage on our own, only then can we hear the voice of God with clarity. It's only then that our empty nets can be filled. So Jesus tells them, cast the net to the right side of the boat and you'll find some fish. And moments later, as the sun is rising over the horizon, they are hauling into their boats more fish than they can count. And the timing here is no coincidence. The text says that it happens just after daybreak. It's a liminal moment. The disciples have found themselves, like we all do at times, in one of those in-between moments in life. A moment between how did I get here and where am I going? Between why isn't this working for me anymore and what am I going to do next? There's a word for this kind of moment. We call it liminality or liminal space, from the Latin limen, meaning threshold. A liminal moment is like a doorway. A liminal space is a moment between what was and what is to come. It's a place of transition and waiting and uncertainty. It's the space where new realities and new identities and new possibilities are birthed. In the story, the disciples are crossing the threshold from night to dawn, from emptiness to abundance, from grief to hope. And as the sun rises, so does promise. Even though we can't yet see it, or can hardly believe it, in the liminality of life, the voice of God is quietly whispering at the edges of our experience. And it says, try something different. Cast your nets to the other side. What worked before will not work now. What got you here won't get you there. Pay attention to the liminal moments, the thresholds of your day. Moments when it seems to you that the answers and uncertainties and assumptions that have always worked in the past for you may now be inadequate. And you begin to feel nudged and called to cast your nets into new waters. The famous Russian author Boris Pasternak once said, "When a great moment knocks on the door of your life, it is often no louder than the beating of your heart, and it is very easy to miss it." But God speaks in the quiet liminal spaces between the familiar what was and the unfamiliar what will be. The thresholds of the heart that call us to risk, to possibility, to novelty. I was talking to someone once who was feeling unfulfilled in her career, sensing that she was just meant to do something more with her life. So she began looking for other jobs. She applied for a position in a completely unrelated field. She breezed through her first interview, was called back for a second interview, which was scheduled over lunch at a local restaurant with two of the company's executives. And during the interview, a woman at a nearby table began screaming for help. Her toddler was choking and had stopped breathing. And no one seemed to be responding. So in the middle of this interview, this woman got up from the table, walked over to the child, and calmly intervened with an abdominal thrust, dislodging the food. When the toddler began breathing again, she reassured the mother that everything was going to be fine. And then she walked back to her table, sat down, and said to her interviews, "I'm sorry, where were we?" She was offered the job on the spot. It's a great story, isn't it? But later that night, she couldn't stop thinking about that experience in the restaurant. She said it was as if she had been there for a reason. She felt this sense of purpose in her life. And that's when it clicked. The next day, she turned down that job offer. She applied for nursing school. And today, she works as a registered nurse. When a great moment knocks on the door of your life, it's often no louder than the beating of your own heart. It's very easy to miss it. Jesus calls out to the disciples from the shoreline, "Come and have breakfast." And Peter can't wait. He leaps from the boat. He throws himself into the water. He swims toward the shore, toward the same Christ just days ago he denied. And there waiting for him is a charcoal fire. The last charcoal fire Peter stood beside was the place of his denial of Jesus, where he swore 3 times, "I do not know the man." But at this new fire, he encounters the flames of forgiveness, the embers of his restoration. In Jesus is there and asks him 3 times, "Do you love me?" And with each yes, Peter's wounded heart is stitched carefully back together. Forgiveness, acceptance, a turning of the page toward a whole new future. In ancient Greece, legend has it that there was a contest to find out who could write a sentence that would somehow always be true. Of the thousands of sentences submitted, the one sentence that won the competition was, "This too shall pass." At the end of the day, ask yourself, have the ears of my heart opened to the voice of God today? And then, in asking the question, remember these points. God comes to us disguised as our life. That when a great moment knocks on the door of your life, it's often no louder than the beating of your heart. And by God's grace, this too shall pass.